Hi, I'm Andre. I'm 25 years old, and for the first 22 years of my life I lived in a very abusive and a very dysfunctional household. My father, I would say, is might be a psychopath or narcissist. I'm not really sure which of them. He really has traits from both, so I suppose malignant narcissism would be a good description of him. My mother, she nibbled him for a very long period of time and developed schizophrenia 10 years ago. So I have had a variety of experiences that I think put together are really quite rare. I want to make this series of videos on abuse because I believe, first and foremost, that I can provide a precedent. I know how helpful it was for me to read about narcissism, for example, and to find that there were people who had similar experiences to mine, whose parents had behaved in similar ways to mine. It's for this that, because I know that there's very little information about, for example, children of schizophrenics and how they cope with their parents' disorder, that I want to provide information that's not already out there, and I want to set this out as YouTube videos because I think showing how I talk about it and showing my facial expression as I talk about it, it can be helpful to those who had also had experiences of abuse, and it can help validate the way you, if you have actually experienced abuse, see things. Another reason why I want to set out this series of videos is because I really genuinely want to help people however I can to get out of abusive situations, to oppose their abusers, really anything, and as well as overcome the trauma that the abuse resulted in, of course. So to that end, I'm also going to be not just talking about my experiences, but also giving practical advice based on my experiences ultimately, and based on my opinions. So it's not something I would want anyone to take for gospel, but nevertheless there are suggestions that I think would be effective to a certain extent. Another reason why I want to start a series of videos is because I'm hoping that a YouTube community might form, and I'm going to be trying to encourage other people to form it, a YouTube channel similar to Self-Harm Support, which is a channel for for people who are carrying out self-harm, to ask questions on that channel and to receive the input of the people organizing that channel. I would like to set up something very similar on the issue of abuse. So apart from that, if you are not a victim of abuse but are interested in the topic, if you actually want to relieve abuse, or if you just stumble on this by accident, I'm hoping that what I'm going to be presenting will be useful in terms of, well, making the case that abuse isn't something that just institutions can resolve very easily, and it's not something that really should be relegated to being other people's problem. I think that in any society, most people just don't really care about anything apart from themselves and their families, so they just accept whatever abuse they might glimpse in the street or whatever they might hear in their neighbors' homes. I think that making the case that abuse is not other people's problem is really, really an important thing. Whether or not even a concerted campaign run by a lot of people on convincing everyone that abuse is their problem would work, I'm not really sure about that. But nonetheless, I think it's a case worth making. And finally, I know from my personal experiences that evil really exists in the world. I know that there are people who are inherently abusive, people who like to cause suffering, and who like to create fear in others, who like to humiliate and belittle others all the time. And if they could get away with it, they would abuse and humiliate and torture everyone they could. And that's their mindset. And I'm surprised when I see people talk about environmental issues, when they talk about greedy corporations, when they talk about greedy lawyers, for example, greedy politicians, and talk about how they lie and how inappropriate it is, but they never stop to think about these people's psyches, about these people's mindsets. I know, for example, how Joseph Stalin, he classically said when his son tried to commit suicide because Joseph Stalin refused to allow him to get married to a particular girl, Joseph Stalin said, "Oh, that boy can't do anything right." And this came from the lips of a man who had murdered millions of people. It so happens that really the kinds of people who are perfectly happy to cause genocide are the same psychopaths who are perfectly happy to torture their children, who are perfectly happy to torture their subordinates if they ever get into a workplace in a high-ranking position. So understanding the relationships between these things, understanding how really people should focus on opposing evil as opposed to opposing the symptoms of evil, that's oil spills by British Petroleum or the invasion of Afghanistan or whatnot. Understanding the nature of evil, I think, would be tremendously helpful in getting people on the right track to actually resolving those issues they care so passionately about. I do rehearse some of the videos I'm making, and at the same time I keep versions of them that are uncut. I will be posting both versions, I think, because, well, it's important to show how someone who's talking about certain things for the first time. I should mention I never actually went to therapy. I did a bit of counseling because I wanted to ask the counselors about my parents, wanted to get some idea about how my parents were, and of course the counselors didn't want to talk about that because they might be liable for lawsuits, so I just left. Basically, I lost my train of thought. I'm not going to be cutting these. I mean, I'm going to be presenting both the uncut versions and the ones I've practiced, because I think that saying things for the first time helps illustrate the emotions one goes through when thinking about them. I know that part of the recovery process for me involved actually saying things to myself in order to recognize how my voice changed when I said them, and that helped me understand my emotions better. So I'm hoping that by illustrating what sort of emotions I'm experiencing when I present my ideas, and by showing these emotions, I can then, I can help people who might feel odd or might feel uncomfortable about the fact that they have similar experiences, similar emotions. That's basically how I'm going to be structuring my videos. That's the reason why I'm going to be making them. I honestly really hope that this will help people, and I want feedback as I'm making them. If there's anything that you would like me to talk about, if there's anything that you find particularly useful or don't find useful at all, please let me know about that. I think I'm going to be starting with my father's behavior. I really want people to understand how callous, manipulative people are like, and I want to give an understanding how psychological abuse works, which is perhaps daunting. It's difficult to explain psychological abuse to other people who haven't experienced it, but I will try to do this in the first part of this series, and in the second part I'm going to be talking about my mother. I'm going to be talking about abuse enabling, and also talking about schizophrenia. I'm not sure, something makes me wonder whether my mother may have had borderline personality disorder, but I cannot really say. I know that my father was narcissistic and was psychopathic just by looking at the traits in the DSM and by speaking to other people whose parents had been diagnosed, or conversing with them on the internet and just taking the word for it, certainly. but I'm not sure about my mother. So I'm also going to be talking about basically how the abuse affected me, how it affected me, my behavior in school, my peer group, everywhere really, how it affected my mindset, how it made me be unaware of my emotions for a very long period of time, and how I recovered from it to a certain extent. I would say I've recovered completely from my father's abuse. My mother's behavior, when she was schizophrenic, when she still is, I think I still have to work on that, but I can certainly provide stories that have a start and have an ending in terms of recovery from parts of my trauma. And I'm also going to be talking about how I perceive the world as a consequence, how I perceive abuse, what I think of people in general who don't really care about abuse at all, who want to sweep it under the rug whenever they see someone being abused. And I'm going to be talking about ideally how giving practical advice, how abusive individuals can be spotted, how to think critically and assess people. I think a lot of people just don't bother to analyze others in great detail. They're not very, I wouldn't say paranoid, they're not very keen on thinking critically, just judging others and examining what they would, and wondering what they would do in certain situations, what these other people would do, and exploring possibilities about them. I don't think people really are very thorough about judging others, and pointing out red flags I think would be very useful to anyone, really. And I'm going to be talking about ways to actually combat abuse, both by raising awareness and by directly taking action against people one sees being abusive in the street or elsewhere. So that's it. I guess if there's one message I could convey, it's that if you've been abused, first of all, people who abused you are complete scumbags. There's absolutely no denying that they are complete scumbags, and they deserve to be considered scumbags. If they're not being considered scumbags by other people, well, shame on the people not considering them scumbags. And honestly, there is no one in the world who can ever invalidate your experiences, who can ever invalidate your feelings or your thoughts. They are there with you, and they're more precious than any sort of complaints or criticism or prejudice anyone may have against you. And finally, and I know that I for a very long period of time felt very isolated. I felt very different from everyone else. Well, I guess I certainly was in some senses, not just because of the abuse I experienced, but also I think I had a very different outlook on life. I'm kind of a geek as opposed to a jock, and I know that even though it can be a very isolating experience, and I know how much I craved support and affection and understanding for a very long period of time, and honestly, I can safely say, without any sort of doubt, that you pretty much have my support and understanding and affection and kindness. I really, if you've been abused, I really want you to completely overcome it and be perfectly happy, and I say this completely unconditionally. So I hope this series of videos will be useful to you, and thanks for watching them.